the second lecture of this series of 4 by George Michell on the treasures of the Deccan. And first, some background. My name is Katrina Hazel and I work as an independent curator. And I would like to start by thanking the Bagri family for its support of this series, and in particular to Alka Bagri, who is here with us tonight, and of course to George for agreeing to my proposal that he give a series of talks. As I said last week, we three have worked together before. Nearly 14 years ago, in my early years as cultural director at Asia House, the Bagri Foundation funded a very popular series by George, held in this very same lecture theatre, on the art and architecture of 16th century India. George is very well known for his scholarly work and fabulous books on Indian and Islamic architecture, art, design, and much, much more, especially of the Deccan. Indeed, he has set up with colleagues a foundation, the Deccan Heritage Foundation, to educate people and help preserve the neglected wonders of that part of India. He is most famous for documenting the great site of Vijayanagara. For nigh on 30 years, he worked and lived for many months each year on site in amongst the stately avenues, temples, palaces, forts, stepwells, and other ruins of that vast site, set in its astonishing lunar landscape on the Tungabhadra River. What a luxury to have George with us tonight to talk about this wondrous place to which he has devoted a lifetime's work. George, welcome.
Katrina, thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you, of course, to Alka Bagri and the Bagri Foundation for having me again. And thank you all for coming on a windy, rather chilly evening to the Deccan. Now, you know, it's very dangerous for lecturers to make assumptions about the audience. And I'm going to make one. I'm going to assume that the audience is divided among those who've been to Hampi, who remember it and want to learn more about it. Maybe they stayed with us or visited us in the camp, the various alumni members here. And those who have heard about Hampi but have not yet got there. So, I mean, I think it's one of those sites which has, I think, over the years exercised increasing magic over all of those who know it and who wish to go there. And there's no doubt it is one of the great discoveries, I think, for visitors. But you have to remember that when we began work there in the 1980s, and with John Fritz, my partner, and various other people who are here tonight, people used to say, where is it and what is it and how do you get there and why would you want to work on it? It's, you know, it's 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, it's too late. It's not too late. Waste your time on this sort of stuff. Anyhow, they don't say that anymore. Now, just a little bit of background. Many of you will know all this, but just for those of you who are wondering how it relates to last week's lecture. Last week we were in the 6th, 7th and 8th centuries, and we were in an area of the Deccan which is now Karnataka, down here, more or less, just along that river. Now we are in the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries. We've sort of gone ahead about 800 years, and we are only about 150 kilometers north, that is, let's say, 3 hours drive north of where we were last week. So we're not really very far away in space at all, but we are in a completely different landscape and a different time era. And again, the Deccan being positioned between the northern part of India and the very south, its location helps explain something of the history of Vijayanagara. Very, very briefly, many of you will know all about this. At the very end of the 13th and into the 14th century, the sultans of Delhi decided they want to increase their empire, and they got all the way down here, and they brought the whole of India, virtually, into their state. This was a very ambitious and a wonderfully conceived project that didn't last very long. So already by 1330s, 1340s, they lost control of the Deccan. And all the old kingdoms that had been there before, they were sort of wiped out, and it was what we might call a sort of power vacuum. Great opportunity for sort of nobodies or little bodies to assert themselves. And there were these brothers called Sangama I, Sangama II, Sangama III, and they seized the moment, and within about 30 years brought a whole chunk of South India under their kingdom, which rapidly assumed the dimensions of an empire. And by empire, I mean a state which had many different languages, many different cults, many different ethnic groups. And they brought that all into one state, using the threat of Delhi, of the sultans of Delhi, and the recently created sultans of the Deccan, which we'll talk about next week, as a sort of threat. In order to fight these sultans, we must bond together, and it worked extremely well for about 200 years, until 1565. So in the middle of the 16th century, a disastrous battle was fought between the Vijayanagara kings and the sultans a little further up here, and the city was sacked and abandoned. So we're dealing with a site which has a 200-year sort of history and was never again built upon. So it makes it a very interesting place to study. It is also an extremely beautiful place. I think all of you who have been to Hampi will still have in your memory this amazing landscape. And the first thing that everybody asks is, well, you know, what is a great capital city of an empire doing in this rugged granite landscape? You know, why build a city here? What's a city doing in this sort of place? But in fact, the landscape is one way of understanding the logic of this city. To begin with, the Sangama brothers, whom I have mentioned to you, they were from this area. They were sort of sons of a local chieftain who somehow survived for a bit under the invasion from Delhi. And then his sons, these brothers, they asserted themselves, but they were local boys from this area. They weren't of any consequence to begin with, but as I said, they rapidly extended their influence. So one, they were local. Two, they needed protection from the sultans to the north. Now, one look at that landscape gives you an idea of the natural protection of the site. So it was quite useful in terms of fortifying the city. The next factor is that this is a very arid part of India. Water is really a difficult commodity. You can't build a city, you can't have a population without running water to sustain agriculture and food. And as you can see, there's a great river running through the site, the Tungabhadra. And this river loses height at this site. What I mean to say is that it tends to slope at this place. It's an ideal site for dams and water channels. And today, the water channels that run through the site are often based on the original 15th and 16th century water channels. So there's a whole hydraulic logic to this site that means it's possible to have people live there, to have food and agriculture. Without the running water, this would not have been possible. Another dimension to the site, which we might think is a little bit fanciful, but was extremely important for the kings, is it was underpinned with a sort of sanctity. It was a sacred place. Now, if you're a sort of a little person in India and you want to become a great king and a great sort of emperor, connecting yourself with local myths and local legends is one way of giving yourself credibility in the eyes of your subjects. And it so happened that Hampi had a very interesting series of mythological systems that they exploited. And one of them is to do with the Ramayana. Most of you will know the story of Rama. I'm not going to relate it here, but one of the chapters in the Ramayana is all about Rama, this sort of kingly god, and his brother looking for Rama's abducted wife, Sita. And they come to this kingdom of the monkeys. The kingdom is called Kishkinda. And it is locally believed here at Hampi that the Hampi site is in fact where this Kishkinda chapter of the Ramayana took place. And there are all sorts of spots within the landscape which are pointed out as related to episodes in the Ramayana. So this natural sort of boulders you see with the whitewash here, that is believed to be the place where Sita's jewels were dropped when she was carried away in an aerial chariot by Ravana, the demon, and they were found and hidden. And when Rama came looking for Sita, somebody showed him the jewels that had been dropped there. So that is, Sugriva's cave. And at the back here you can see a mighty mountain, the highest point of the site with a little temple on the top, and that is where Hanuman is supposed to have been born. Anjanadri Hill it's called. Hanuman, of course, was the monkey warrior hero who went off, found where Sita was, and helped Rama get Sita back. So all these stories of the Ramayana are linked with the landscape. And even though Vijayanagara as a city is now a ruin, many people visit Hampi because it is still a living Ramayana site. Here is a sculpture of Hanuman being very sort of, how to say, valiant, with his arm up like this, cut into one of the rocks. So the actual landscape itself is full of imagery of the mythology. Nor is this the only mythological system. Here we have a marriage scene painted onto the ceiling of the Virupaksha temple in Hampi village. And you can't see very clearly, but there is a god and goddess being married. This is the god Shiva, under the name Virupaksha, marrying a local girl, who was very beautiful, called Pampa. Now, she did a sort of wet sari routine to seduce this. You know this from Bollywood movies, but I have to tell you, this has quite a mythological. She was very beautiful, she cooked food, she gave it to all the rishis, the sages who were on the hill up nearby. She was very pious, blah, blah, all that sort of stuff. But she also bathed in the local river. And there she was observed by Shiva, you know, the great god, and he came down and was betrothed to her, and she became Mrs. Shiva. Or more to the point, he became Mr. Pampa. So, don't laugh, the god is called in the temple Pampapati, the Lord of Pampa. So he gains credibility from his connection with the goddess. So this is a Shiva sort of goddess connection which intersects with the Ramayana connection. All very important because this is where the kings of Vijayanagara sponsored all these temples and gained credibility from this. And we have these sorts of things in the landscape. This is a mandala, a sacred diagram made up of little lingas. And there's a linga in the middle, phallic emblem of Shiva, which you can pour libations on with a little spout to direct. You can see, whoops. So you pour it here and then it goes out here. So that the landscape itself becomes a sort of shrine. And then we have things like this. This is the man-lion form of Vishnu, Narasimha. You will know it from standard mythology. And what you're looking at is cut out of a single huge boulder. And it was a royal commission. Krishnadeva, one of the great kings in the 1520s, ordered this rock to be carved away, cut in the shape of Narasimha. And it's not that Krishnadeva was particularly pious. He was anxious to co-opt a set of warriors from a part of what is now Andhra, was part of his kingdom, who were great worshippers of Narasimha. And one way to incorporate these Nayak warriors into his kingdom and make them work for him and to help him govern was to have a shrine made to their god. And so he created this Narasimha monolith. Now this is the map that was made by a whole group of us. John Fritz, with whom I work, is an archaeologist. We had a whole lot of volunteers, some of whom are here tonight. It was a sort of an annual winter season, and we kept on having lots and lots of architecture students, architects, archaeologists, and through the year people would get in touch with us and say, we've heard about this wonderful place, and we'd say, there's no money, there's no accommodation, there's barely a bathroom, you can't get there, all that sort of stuff. They still came. So this is the map that we eventually made. It's a sketch map. Here is the river. This is the river that we showed you, the picture of the Tungabhadra River. And along the shores of the river and tucked into the hills are these great temple complexes. And they have streets. See, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. And we call this the sacred center. And here is the village of Hampi, which gives its name to the whole site. I mean, it was called the City of Victory, Vijayanagara. And down here, separated, about 1.5 kilometers, is the royal center. See, this is 1 kilometer here, so you're dealing with about 4 kilometers, 4.5 kilometers here, by about 6. So you're looking at 25 square kilometers of ruins, and I have to tell you, that's not the whole site. This is just the central area. And this is the fortified urban core. You can see a complete circuit of walls, and then there are other walls, and so forth, so the concentric circles. It's one of the most enormous, I would say, urban sites that we have from India, and it's certainly the earliest and perhaps best preserved Hindu royal site that we have. So I'll be showing you some pictures of the temples here, and then some of the examples of the buildings in the royal centre. The village of, up here, Anagondi, and the village of Kamalapura, these are modern day settlements too, and I'll tell you a bit about Hampi afterwards. So this is one of the gateways on Hemakuta Hill above Hampi, one of the earliest parts of the city. We're talking here the early part of the 14th century. You can see it's rather crude with this type of architecture. Of course, it's all vertical and horizontal blocks of granite. And because the structures are built out of the same material as the landscape, everything blends together so that you have this sort of effect of man-made and natural sort of blending together in, of course, fantastic juxtaposition. It's quite hard to take a really bad photograph here because everything looks so terrific. So this is the gateway at the top of Hemakuta Hill. And this is a view of some of the shrines on Hemakuta. It's a cluster of basically 14th century shrines, and you can see these little pyramids of stone. So they're built entirely in granite. They're quite modest architecturally. They're very typical of Deccan architecture in the 13th and 14th century. So they're not very important architecturally, but what is very important is why they are built here. And one of them, in fact, is built by a local chieftain who employed Sangama, whose sons began the kingdom. And this is the memorial shrine that was built at the very beginning of the 14th century by one of these local chiefs. And we have an inscription in it which tells us that this shrine was to commemorate his father, his mother, and I think some grandparent. So these shrines were not just pious places to worship Shiva, they were connected with commemorating part of the family at a sacred place. So Hampi was already a sacred spot just before the foundation of the kingdom. And this is the type of drawings that we did with our architecture students, and you can see again these pyramidal stone layer-caked type sort of superstructures typical of the 14th century. And inside looks like this. Nothing very elaborate, but just typical of the early architecture we have at the site with these sort of quite simple columns. This is a slightly later version of this type of architecture, again with granite. And this picture was taken before the archaeologists got their fingers on it, and it's rather picturesque in disarray. It's a Krishna temple in the middle of the fields, just abandoned, unprotected, and one of the buildings that we enjoyed documenting at the time. And then, by the turn of the 15th century, we're getting temples that look like this. This is dedicated to Rama and is sometimes known as the Hazara Rama temple. Any of you who've been to Hampi will remember it, of course. And here you can see the towers are no longer built in granite, but in brick, and were originally covered with plaster. And I would have guessed that because there would have been a little bit of colour and plaster on the granite, you wouldn't have noticed the transition from granite to brick. Notice it's in sort of stories, and there are all these sort of columned bays. Now, for those of you who were came to our talk last week, you will recognise this is built in a typical South Indian Dravida style. In fact, it's extremely Tamil, and it's the beginning of the Tamil influence on the architecture of Vijayanagara. This was a royal chapel, I think we can call it. It was not intended for the public. It was inside the palace zone, and only the king and the inner members of the royal household would have been permitted to come there and worship. And there's no doubt, being dedicated to Rama, who was a kingly god, there was some link between Devaraya the first and the god Rama. And what is interesting for us is that the story of the Ramayana is told on the building itself. There are exactly 108 panels, 108 of course as you know, auspicious number, but we've counted them up and they really are. And they are arranged in rows like this, from the bottom to the top, all in clockwise direction. So if you go 3 times around the shrine, you do the lower, middle, and upper shrine, you get more or less the whole story. And there are scenes here of fire sacrifice, and Dasharatha, who has to give a boon to his queen, and starts the whole thing rolling because he's not allowed to have Rama, his favourite son, on the throne, but she insists that her son is put on the throne, therefore Rama has to go into exile, and therefore the story starts. And here's Rama shooting through 7 palm trees, and he kills the bad monkey king Yavali, who's seen here dying, and then Hanuman appears before him, and so forth and so on. So it's a wonderful sort of cartoon strip sort of version of the Ramayana story. This is another panel from the temple. This is a key scene. Here Rama seated, you see rather uncomfortably with one leg over the other like that, but that's a royal way of sitting. according to South Indian iconography, under a tree, with his brother, Lakshmana there. He is giving his ring to Hanuman. He's saying, you go and find Sita, if and when you find her, hopefully, give her my ring so she will know that you've come from me. And on the other side of the temple, in exactly the same location, we have Sita giving her jewel from her hair to Hanuman to give it back to Rama. So these two scenes sort of juxtapose each other in the story, and it shows you that there was what we would call in the West a sort of program. Somebody had worked out how to tell the story within an architectural setting. All these episodes are perfectly balanced. When you go to the outside of the temple, it's surrounded by a great wall, we have these wonderful sculptures, and these are completely not mythological. They are totally royal. And here we have one of the most magnificent, I would say, portrayals of royal processions to be seen anywhere in Indian art. Here you have the elephants, the great elephants. Here you have the horses. The horses are not being ridden. They're not paraded for horse riders, they're paraded for horses. This is what the king had. Then we have all these warrior contingents, and then we have these dancing women. And these processions go in a continuous clockwise direction, of course, towards seated royal figures. And if they remind you of Persepolis or something like this, you wouldn't be the first people to think like that. We don't have anything else, really, in Indian art quite like this royal display. So the temple has a real royal exterior, I would say, character, with all the Ramayana inside. Here I think I have a little detail. Again, you can see the elephants. Each one is different. Look at the horses, and look at these characters. You can't see them very clearly, but they're clearly not Indian. They're dressed in long tunics, they have beards, they have funny turbans, and they wear shoes. They are, in fact, the Arab merchants and seafarers who brought the horses across the Arabian Sea to the Vijayanagara kings. And the Vijayanagara kings were very keen on having horses, and they weren't too good at breeding them, so they needed them all the time. There was this constant requirement, and apparently they paid handsomely for it, and it's said that even if a horse died on the journey, and the Arabs presented a tail of a dead horse, they still got paid. They wanted a monopoly on horses. And then we have all these military contingents, and each group of warriors have different weapons, different hairstyles, different accoutrements, and no doubt they are something to do with the different contingents of the Vijayanagara army, perhaps drawn from the different provinces of the empire. And at the top we have dancing. And these processions all went on at various festivals that were held at Vijayanagara, especially the Mahanavami, or the Nine Nights festival. And from that festival we have a Persian observer in the 1420s, and we have Portuguese observers. When the Portuguese arrived at Goa, they took over the sea trade of the Arabian Sea, and they got the monopoly of horses, and they started to have the horse trade, and they described these processions which they saw at the capital. Anyhow, we'll come to the Portuguese in a minute. Now, in the 16th century, we move on to another type of architecture. This looks uncomfortably like a Greek temple, doesn't it? But it's not. It's a Vijayanagara temple to Ganesh on the ridge overlooking Hampi. But look at these very, very slender granite columns. This is the portico, and inside is a great boulder sculpted with Ganesh. So it's built around a piece of nature. It's quite an amazing temple. And this is a piece of architecture that was built by this great king, Krishnadeva, once he attained the throne in 1510. And he added on to an earlier shrine of Virupaksha and Pampa, the Shiva and goddess cult that I mentioned, and he added this absolutely magnificent hall. And the architecture of this hall was something completely different. We'd never seen anything like this in South India before. And this gives you an idea of the type of designs that were evolved. These are all single slabs of granite. These are a couple of the piers in the temple there, the Virupaksha temple. These are drawings that were done by our architecture students. And you can see this is a cutout colonnette. And it's like a little miniature column, but it's attached to the main shaft. And here we have a leaping, fantastic animal with a warrior. And this type of animal column and clustered colonnette column becomes the key feature of Vijayanagara temple architecture and then gets exported to other parts of South India in later times. So we're dealing with now the early part of the 16th century. All these great temples that were built in this later period all had great tanks for bathing. This is a tank associated with a Krishna temple, and you can see that it has a little island pavilion in the middle. What's this thing here? And surrounded by water with the steps going down. So it's a bit dilapidated now. It's been renovated recently, but these great tanks still are filled with rainwater each season and were used by worshippers to bathe in before they went into the temple. Now we're on top of the highest point within the urban core, and we're looking down at this great temple, which has two concentric enclosures, one within the other, and here's the main temple, and then this great street running northwards towards the river, with colonnades along it, and even though there are fields in it, or there were at that time, this was a festival street where chariots were carried up and down. It was a great market street because these temples were absolutely crowded with people at festival time and needed to have places where commerce could take place and where rituals could take place. And we know from the visitors to Hampi of the jewels, the diamonds, the wonderful goods, the food, and even the women who were for sale in the bazaar. So this is something that attracted everybody. Now we're moving into another part of the sacred centre towards the Vittala temple, and here is a sort of funny portal which once had a metallic balance where the king would be balanced against grain and other precious things which would then be distributed to the Brahmin priests, part of his annual ceremonies. And we arrive then at the Vittala temple. Here's a part of the natural landscape, and there in the background you can see this great monument with all its colonnaded streets. Just look at this. It looks more like a Roman ruin than something from South India. These great streets which had pavements, and remember in the 16th century stone paved streets were not that common, even in Europe, so it's something which is most unusual. And this great big temple, which was probably begun in the 16th century and added on to all the way up until the middle of the century when the city was eventually sacked and abandoned. This is the plan, one of the drawings, and you can see it's a regular compound. Here is the main temple, which was the original structure, and this was added on. I'll show you some pictures. And here is the famous chariot shrine, which some of you will remember if you've been to Hampi. I'll show you in a minute. This is the entrance to the temple, and it's the South Indian gopura, this classical way of making a gateway into a towered feature. And again, you can see brick and plaster, a bit damaged, it's lost its timber sort of structure inside, and so it's dilapidated. It's been rather not perfectly, I'd say, restored, and then the granite bottom, which is much better preserved. So you go through this, and then you come to the main temple, again with a brick and plaster tower over the sanctuary, and a rather austere sort of exterior, you just divide in pilasters. I wouldn't say very decorated or very ornamented, but monumental. This is it has to be imposing. But it's this which is the glory of the temple. This is the mandapa, the hall, that was added in the 1550s, only a few years before the destruction of the temple, by a military commander, and it's one of the great showpieces of South Indian architecture and art. Every support, you see, is divided into a cluster of little cut-out colonnettes and sculptures. It's a sort of dazzling, virtuoso display of cut granite techniques. And one of the effects of such a complex architecture is that the glare, the external light, which is very glary in this part of India, is sort of filtered, so it has a very soft, illuminated effect inside. And these brackets, you see, go up and up and up and carry these enormous spans of granite that roof the various interior halls. Another detail from the Vittala temple, you can see here these fantastical animals which have sort of lion-like bodies with a sort of elephant snout, and they're ridden by warriors. And these warriors are all in different dresses. Some of them appear to be South Indian, of course. Others have a faintly Muslim look. They have beards, they have turbans, they have slippers. Others may even be Europeans. These were all the people who were mercenaries in the Vijayanagara army. and we await a proper study of the details of these characters. And this is the famous chariot shrine. I'm sure nobody here who's been to Hampi will have forgotten this. This is where Garuda, who is the vehicle of Vishnu, was accommodated, gazing into the temple where Vijayanagara, was a form of Vishnu, was worshipped. Now, these are stone wheels, and when I first went to Hampi, these could be sort of moved. They weren't actually attached to the, cemented to the base. They could be moved. Of course, the thing doesn't move at all as a whole, but it reproduces a mobile wooden chariot, which often have stone wheels. And it's a fantastic invention. Whether it was inspired by the chariot temple at Konarak in Orissa, that some of you may know, because Krishnadeva, many of the Vijayanagara kings did campaigns into Orissa, is something we can only speculate on. Anyhow, it's the earliest example within South India of such a shrine. And as you can see, it has no tower. It just sort of abruptly finishes, which is a great shame, because once it did have a tower. This is a photograph of Alexander Greenlaw, who was somebody we discovered, and this is a photograph from about 1856, a very, very early photograph for India, just about anywhere in the world. A waxed paper negative, there's a print from that, and you can see it had a dilapidated, but nonetheless, a brick tower. And some archaeologist, a Brit I guess, in about the 1870s decided it was falling down, and he pulled it down, and since then it's never had a tower, which is a great shame, because it lacks that sort of elegance. And here, on the base of this Garuda chariot shrine, we have a little frieze in which we can see these characters leading horses. And now, in the 16th century, the Arabs are no longer in charge of the Arabian Sea trade, and no doubt these curious figures are Indian representations of Portuguese, because the Portuguese were then, of course, the chief traders in horses. And as some of you may know, the descriptions and the accounts of Vijayanagara and the kings by the Portuguese horse traders are among the most important historical sources we have. We've got two great accounts, and if any of you buy or have already our little guidebook that John and I wrote, we've got translations of those Portuguese accounts of what was going on at Hampi when they visited in the early 16th century. Now we're going to go 1.5 kilometres, 2 kilometres to the south to the royal centre. What's extremely important about this part of the site is that it is the largest and most, I would say, evolved example of a Hindu royal capital. You see, we are not short of temples from all periods of South India. As you know, you've been to, I don't know, Tanjore, all these Madurai, all these places, you can see temples, but you can't see palaces, you can't see pleasure pavilions, you can't see bathing spots, you can't see granaries, stables, all the other things that went on in a royal site. But at Hampi Vijayanagara, we have remains of a complete spectrum of royal architecture, which gives us insight into life at this city. And our analysis of the plan is quite simple. We believe there is a sort of line running through the middle of the site with the Rama temple that I showed you in the middle, separating the more public part of the site from the more private. And we call this royal performance and the zone of royal residence. So here tend to be the places where the king and the household live, the palaces, the private bathing places, the private shrines. Here in the middle is the king's main chapel, and here are the ceremonial structures and the things to do with military, the elephant stables and parade ground, and the bathing places, not for the queens of the court, but for the royal male figures, the pleasure pavilions, let's say. And I think this is quite interesting, and it's very difficult to get from one side to the other. There's almost no through passages, very, very few. There is this sort of corridor that runs along here, and I think this shows it. Here is part of this walled sort of alleyway with almost no access one side or the other, and you can see it runs straight in to the sanctuary of the Rama temple. And John Fritz has suggested that this position of the god Rama at the very core of the king's sort of enclosures may be a sort of clue as to the way in which this god and the kings of Vijayanagara coalesced. There was a sort of Rama aspect to the kingship. Not only that, if you look at the tower of the temple, you'll see it's almost exactly aligned with the summit of this mountain, of which there's a little shrine on the top. And this hill, like other hills at the site, is linked with the Ramayana story. So it's called Matanga Hill, and Matanga was a saint who protected the good monkey king and somehow is part of the story. So the temple itself is not only set within a built environment that is symbolic, but is linked spatially to the natural environment. So we have a sort of logic to do with landscape and a logic to do with architecture and mythology that gives meaning to this part of the site. And I would say this sort of interpretation is something we're still developing, but it is a very exciting site to think about. And this is what part of the site looks like today. Here we have the Rama temple that I showed you with the royal reliefs on the outside and the Ramayana reliefs on the inside. And these are the cleared, partly excavated, partly reconstructed bits and pieces of the royal centre. Now what you're looking at is a sort of masonry skeleton. We're missing all the timber, all the ivory, all the metal, all the gold, all the jewels, all the stuff. All that was burnt, pillaged, lost, gone. But the study of this architecture gives us an insight into a complete royal sort of centre. And of course, it reminds us of classical archaeology in the Mediterranean. But we have nothing like this for earlier periods in South India. If you go to the Chola capitals, or the Hoysala capitals, or the Chalukya capitals, going right back to the 6th or 7th centuries, you cannot find anything like this. We've lost it. So whatever was built has gone. But from Vijayanagara, we start to have a complete spectrum of royal buildings. And one of the most important discoveries was this zone. This was a complete sort of bare hill when we first visited, and the Karnataka Department of Archaeology has cleared this site more or less systematically to reveal the basements and portions of royal residences. And I'll show you an example soon. This is like a royal quarter. They call it the nobleman's quarter. We have no evidence that any particular nobleman's lived there, but it doesn't matter. It is a sort of dense quarter where the elite of the court was accommodated in these separate structures. Now these buildings probably had multiple functions. There were places where people lived, people slept, people ate, people received, people were entertained. They were not single functional buildings, and we can call them palaces in a general sense. And here's a drawing of one of them as was excavated. And the thing that's interesting, it's all on different levels. You move your way all the way up until you come to the highest, centralmost chamber. It's a bit like a temple in a way that's laid out. And these little crosses, you can just see them here. These are all basements, footing blocks for wooden columns. And little bits of wood were found in the excavation burnt. So it had a whole timber architecture that went with it. And there were little plaster carvings and sculptures of perhaps royal figures. Maybe there were portraits there, we don't exactly know. But even though it's very sort of fragmentary, it's very important for our understanding of royal secular architecture. This is a balustrade flanking a staircase, you see, with a sort of a mythical snarling animal as you go up into the first level of a particular palace. Now, this part of the site is a long way from the river, and it could only work if water was flowing through it. So the great thing about this site, there's a complex hydraulic system. This is, of course, a water channel raised up, a sort of aqueduct going around the corner like this. And through the Royal Centre were various water channels. And we've had a Cambridge student did a PhD on the hydraulics of Vijayanagara, which was very useful, which we eventually published. And it's all full of bathing pools and places where water can be channeled and funneled. And remember, in an arid climate, running water was, of course, an extraordinary luxury. Anyhow, one of the Indian archaeologists saw this spout. You can see this dipping here. And in the early 1980s, when we began work, this spout went straight into a piece of empty ground. And he thought, quite correctly, what is this spout doing? So he did an excavation, and this is what he discovered. This is, I would say, the most spectacular discovery at the site since we have been there from the early 1980s, and our early plans of the site don't show it. So it wasn't there, and this was cut out of the earth, and has not been reconstructed. Nothing, it's exactly as it was found. And it's very, very intriguing. It's a stepped well. Those of you who've been, say, in Rajasthan and Gujarat will have seen such wells, I think. And it's arranged in such a way that at whatever level the water is at, you can reach it. So if the water is up here at the rainy season or down here, you can always go down. Look at the symmetry of it, the way it catches the light and shade, the geometry to the eye. It's very, very pleasing. Anyhow, it's also very intriguing because it's built not out of local granite. There's no shortage of granite. It's built out of sort of greenish schist, which is not local, but is found about 120 kilometers away. There's quite a lot of it there. And every one of these blocks has a little instruction in local script, which says north, tier 4, level 6. North, tier 5, level 7, etc., etc. And we've formed the idea that this well, unbelievably as it might seem to you, was actually brought from somewhere else. That King Krishnadeva, God knows whom, was going past and he saw this wonderful 11th, 12th century stepwell and he said, I want one of these in my capital, please. So 1,225 bullock carts were sent. And you see, they're not big pieces of stone. It's just a matter of manpower and a few bullocks. You can bring the whole thing in. And I think it's most likely that, in fact, is what happened. Because how else do you explain all these instructions? You don't need to put those instructions on. It's a typical thing when you pull a building to pieces and you put it back again. So I think it's likely, this is, let's say, the current thought on this stepwell. But it's one of the wonders of the Royal Centre. Another wonder is this great platform quite nearby. Here in the distance you can see this platform. It's solid. It's built in several stages with a sort of schist sort of front. And steps going up. It looks, horribly like something in the Yucatan, but it's not. It's a South Indian ceremonial platform, on top of which must have been some timber pavilion, maybe with ivory plaques and inset jewels. We can only guess. We have descriptions. But we know that the king, at the Mahanavami platform, publicly worshipped the goddess Durga in order to invest himself, his weapons, his animals, his troops, with superpowers before he went on military campaigns. And this was done in a public fashion, so everybody could see. It was also a moment in the year when all the provincial governors had to come to the capital to pay their taxes and pay their respects to the king. So this display of public worship had a real political, I would say, function. And the sides of this platform, especially the bottom layer, which is probably 14th century from the very first part of the history of the site, is covered with reliefs. And there's not one scene here which is mythological. They are all to do with the life of the king and the court. And they do give us an insight into the way in which kings thought about themselves. So we have, of course, prancing horses. We have hunting scenes here. We have a couple of camels. I don't know what they were doing in Karnataka. Even 2 or 3 of them would have been awesome, I guess. And so they're all the pursuits of kingship, the things that kings are concerned with and want to show on such a monument. Here is, of course, a lovely scene. Don't get confused. This bouffant hairdo does not mean a woman. This is a royal figure, we think, larger, of course, than his companion, shooting at deer that are prancing in the most lifelike way. Now, this is not one of the most subtle pieces of sculpture in India, but I think you'll agree it has a fantastic vitality. And it's a sort of another school of art that existed in the 14th century. And here we have a very interesting scene. We have a seated character. Look at his leg. It's just like Rama that I showed you earlier on. But it is a royal figure who's sitting here. Somebody's waving a little sort of tassel over him. And there are these characters here with their hands down in submission. I don't think they're necessarily prisoners, but they have warriors next to them. They're coming to pay their respects. They have beards, they have long tunics, and they have funny pointed hats, and they are Muslim. And they are probably from the Sultanate courts to the north. They may even be foreigners. And some of the characters that are portrayed here, like these, seem to be definitely non-Indian Muslims, and we suspect they are Central Asian Turks. And they have funny sort of cloaks, their beards, and they have these little pleated hats with turn-ups. And if you go to markets in Kyrgyzstan, as we did once, we found felt hats that looked exactly like this. So it is possible that these Central Asian Turks arrived in the Deccan with the Delhi Sultans, and when the Delhi Sultans retreated, they found work for a couple of generations as entertainers, guardians, horse trainers with the Vijayanagara kings. They disappear in the 15th century. But the Vijayanagara kings, though they were Hindu, had no problems about employing Muslims. And we must get away from this idea of Hindu versus Muslim. This was a state that adapted itself to the Islamic period of Indian history and warfare and architecture, as you will see. There were, of course, a few Muslims who were employed at the capital and who attained considerable status, probably in the cavalry, we guess, to do with horses. This is a mosque, believe it or not, and this is a tomb of somebody called Mr. Ahmed Khan. We've got no idea who he is, but his name is recorded, and he was permitted to build his own tomb and what he called a place of worship, which we recognize as a mosque. It has a mihrab, but it's built in the style of a sort of temple. Nonetheless, it shows you that high-class Muslims were able to build and live within the urban core. There's what we call a Muslim quarter, which has some of these buildings. And the presence of these people and the interaction with the courts of the Deccan, which was Sultan, it explains some of these bizarre architectural forms we have. Here we have a watchtower and the remains of a palace. You see these wonderful things. And this watchtower type of architecture resulted in these hybrid schemes. This is a piece of architecture which brings together elements from temple architecture and from Islamic architecture. So all these pointed arched openings are not known in South Indian temple architecture, but they're typical of Islamic architecture. And then there are all these funny little sort of, these little pinnacles which we get in temples with a dome. So it's a sort of Vijayanagara courtly cocktail, if you like, architecturally. And it's something that's only found in the royal centre. It's something which was sponsored evidently by the kings, and it was identified with the court, this type of architecture. There was no sense, I think, that arches, domes, vaults, things that we think are Islamic or non-Indian, were considered inappropriate within this context. Here is a two-storied pavilion. We don't know the exact function, but it's within the private zone of the palace. It must have perhaps been used by courtly women, sort of hang out, and how they got up, we're not quite sure, because this one doesn't seem to have a ladder. But it would have no doubt at the time. Perhaps it would. So, again, with a funny sort of tower, look at these arches, and all sorts of brackets and decoration, look at this treatment. Very typical of Sultanate architecture. And if those of you have the patience and time to come next week, I'll show you what was being built in Gulbarga and Bidar at the same time as this. Now, this is the so-called Queen's Bath. These names you have to, take with a grain of salt. I mean, this is a place, I would say, where men of the court went to recreate with their lady friends who are not their queens or their family members. And I would have thought. Wet sari, right? Yes. Now, here we have, this was all cotton growing up. This is an 1856 photograph, and it's interesting because it shows a couple of towers of this fanciful design which are no longer extant. Somehow they've gone. This is the interior of the Queen's Bath. This was filled with water, and there were probably women sort of cavorting around in the water, and men would be, I would think, sort of recreating here. It's a sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll sort of place, if you know what I mean. And we got into terrible trouble here because we had one of our team members had a birthday one year, and I think I can't remember who it was exactly, but the group of architecture students, they were always big troublemakers. They decided they'd have a midnight party here, and they put candles everywhere and textiles, and it was absolutely wonderful. They were the days before there were any tickets or wire or, guardians, but unfortunately they left a couple of beer bottles there, and I got into big trouble the next morning. So anyhow, but I think it was in the spirit of the place, a sort of... and there are little holes here in the bottom where we wonder whether they were for wooden poles for a canopy, so that you could have, shade. And there are water channels all around, entry channels, exit channels, and canals. So the whole thing of water and recreation. And then we come to something called the Lotus Mahal, Don't get excited about that name. It's probably a 19th century British idea. And everybody thought it was all to do with the Zanana and the women, and fantasies were being hatched about women cavorting. Actually, I think it's probably a council chamber of the king or the commander of the army, because the elephant stables and the parade ground is just nearby. So that's what it would have been used for. Again, with these Islamic type of arches, these trefoil arches with decoration, I'll show you in a minute, but with temple-like towers. And it's laid out on a mandala with projections on either side. So it's a wonderful, I would say, amalgam of different traditions. A Vijayanagara courtly invention, which goes on into later South India. If you've seen the palaces, let's say Madurai or Tanjore, they continue this type of architecture with its Islamic things. So this is the Lotus Mahal, and of course it survives better than the other palaces because it was built entirely of masonry. It wasn't built with wood, and therefore it wasn't burnt. It was built of little bits of stone, roughly shaped, and then finished with wonderful plaster. And this type of technique of building, mortared stonework, cloaked in plaster, is of course something which was learned from the Islamic architectural tradition. It doesn't exist in South India before. Look at the decoration, this type of stylized foliation, and these roundels with sort of arabesque, typical of 15th century and early 16th century Deccan architecture and art, but with a nice Hindu sort of monster mask here, and sometimes little geese in here. See, so it's got a sort of Hindu flavour. It's again a mix of Muslim architectural devices and Hindu ones, and it's a little fragment left, and it gives you just a glimpse of how glorious these buildings must have been. And this, of course, is the most famous building of the whole, I would say, this style. These are the elephant stables. And as I always say, when we talk about this, when we first got there, we thought, well, this can't possibly be true. How could they? It must be a sort of, a British nonsense for the 19th century. And we racked our heads over it for 20 years, and in the end we concluded that, yes, it was the elephant stables. But these were not everyday garages for elephants, right? These were not where elephants stayed all the time. They were brought in for special occasions. You have to think of the Royal Centre as a sort of theatre where the king put on great shows at occasions during the year, not all the time. And elephants would have been brought here for special occasions, perhaps stationed in front of each of these. And it faces onto a huge square, which is now very attractively planted with grass and flowers, but which was not planted originally. It would have been a Maidan, that is a parade ground, where troops and animals would have been, processed. And this upper chamber in the middle, I think, would have been a Naubat Khana, a place where drums and instruments, musical instruments, would have been, musicians would have been there to beat the rhythms by which the troops and the animals would have paraded. And of course, it's a marvelous piece of architecture because it's totally symmetrical with this combination of smooth domes, fluted domes, and 12-sided polygonal sort of vaults, all arranged in mirror symmetry around this axis. This is a view from the top showing the plain domes and the fluted domes and these vaults. Nothing like this is known anywhere else in Indian architecture at the time, but each individual bit of it, like this little bit on its own, is exactly like a late 15th, early 16th century domed tomb. So if you go to Gulbarga or Bidai, you'll see tombs that look a bit like this, but here assembled in a row, which you will not find anywhere else in India. It gives you an idea of the inventiveness of the architects of Vijayanagara. And this is the view of how it appears today. So, as again I said, this is a bit misleading, and somebody else put some stone steps in here. So somebody said, well, how could the elephants go into a stone? I said, but these were not original. When we worked here first, these were just dirt floors, which of course is correct for elephants. So this is the great elephant stables at Vijayanagara. So I'm not going to show you more of the glories of Vijayanagara. I think this gives you a good idea. Unfortunately, not everything about Vijayanagara is great. This is just a view of a temple festival inside the Virupaksha shrine at Hampi village to show you that religious life is still continuing within part of the site. Here you see everybody's brought little oil lamps. It's on one of the occasions of the betrothal of Virupaksha and the goddess Pampa, and everybody is in on the act. So this is very much a temple that has continued in religious life, unlike the rest of the site, which has become a ruin. And unfortunately, the news about Hampi is not altogether good. In front of the temple of Virupaksha is a great colonnaded street, and many of you who've been there will remember the lovely little shops and residences and guest houses and internet cafes that worked when electricity was available, and a bank which never seemed to work, and a post office which was quite efficient. All these things were in Hampi village, and it was a charming place to stay. UNESCO and the management of the site have always recommended that people who lived in or near the site should be involved with the heritage of Hampi because they have a stake in it. Unfortunately, the district commissioner, who was the most important person in this area, he had the idea that all this was a threat to the heritage, and because it was a UNESCO World Heritage Site, all these people camping in what had been a bazaar, who had turned it back into a bazaar, where tourists and pilgrims could be, find services. This was all illegal and should not be encouraged, and he went in with bulldozers and got rid of all the houses and guest houses, internet cafes and hotels, and there are only just a few houses over there. And it just shows you how a site like this has been wrongly managed and pillaged, and it has turned many of our friends who were living there, who were shopkeepers, who had residences or guest houses, into sort of refugees, and these people were not given sufficient or any real compensation. And one of the things that we hope to do with our Deccan Heritage Foundation is to sponsor a study on how to rehabilitate this bazaar, to work out a way in which the ancient colonnades, which are sort of just dilapidated here, could be rehabilitated, and we could show people in Hampi how to make a living bazaar that also respects the heritage into something that would again have some sort of life. So any of you have any spare change, this is the moment, because it's a very worthwhile thing, and we applied now to the US Ambassadors Fund to see if we can raise some money to get a young architectural conservationist locally to help us with this. So Hampi it's a magnificent subject. It's a fantastic site. It's an inspiration to everybody who goes there for the beauty of the landscape, the range of the architecture, the incredible intersection of mythology, history, kingship, symbolism, everything you could possibly want in a great site. The one thing that is missing is, I would say, professional management. And it's very distressing for us who've been at the site for so many years to see it now going through this bad patch. So those of you who remember the lovely little bazaars and places to eat, the Riverside Cafe that you may have gone to, or the Mango Tree Restaurant, which was so gorgeous overlooking the river, all gone. So it's really, I hope those of you who have been in the past will have good memories, and those of you who go in the future will just have to overlook this little bad patch. The rest of the site is an inspiration, and I wish all of you the chance to go who have not yet been. Thank you very much.
Questions, and we have microphones on either side of the hall. Anybody would like to start? There's a gentleman over there.
A very quick question. At its height, how many people lived in and around that particular site?
Everybody asks us, what was the population of Vijayanagara? Well, we have no way of coming to any sort of accurate estimate. There must have been many hundreds of thousands of people, especially when the king and the court were in residence. Remember, they spent many months away, and it wasn't just the king himself, but the whole court, the whole military left, and probably that was a very different population. 500,000? It was, the Portuguese said it was the biggest city they had seen, but what had they seen? Lisbon can't have been very big in the early 16th century, so, I mean, their comment isn't very helpful, but it was, I think, one of the wealthiest and largest cities of Asia in the first half of the 16th century. But I'm sorry, we have no way of estimating.
What language did they speak?
Right, well, in Karnataka, Kannada is the language. In the adjacent Andhra zone, Telugu is the language, and down in Tamil Nadu, Tamil. And we have inscriptions mostly in medieval Kannada language, but there are several moments, several places at the site where you have Kannada, Telugu and Tamil. 3 languages placed, which shows you these were the languages that were spoken. But the literature of the court was both Kannada and Telugu.
Travellers' accounts, current and contemporary Vijayanagara Empire, about foreigners?
Yes, we do have these. It's a question about travellers' accounts. We have one in the 1430s who came from Herat. So it's a very interesting, brief account of the site. His name now escapes me, but one of those, Abdul Razak. Yes. And then we have 2 Portuguese horse traders who came through in the early 16th century, and they wrote their accounts, of course, in retrospect, but they are extremely interesting and detailed, and they tried to put together what they could learn of the history of the kingdom and their observations of the city, the court, the bazaars and everything, and you can read these.
And you have notes of these in your small book, don't
In
you?
the little guidebook
Yes.
that we've put together, John and I, we have translations of all the descriptions of the city by these visitors.
And I hope that book's for sale outside.
No, it will have been exhausted by now.
Why was the city abandoned?
Why was it abandoned? Well, of course, they lost this battle. The invading troops came in, sacked and burnt the city. The question is, why didn't they re-establish the city? I think it was realized that they were too close to the frontier with the Sultanate kingdoms, so they retreated further south to a safer distance. I guess it's a bit like Istanbul being abandoned as the capital of modern Turkey because they lost all the European provinces and they retreated to Ankara, more in the heartland of Turkey. It was something like that. They were too close to the frontier for safety. And without the kingdom, it was a sort of Washington. You know, without the court, without the army, without all that there was no reason for that place to exist. It really was a royal invention.
Did you make it clear, George, and maybe I just missed this, that there was a date, wasn't it?
1565, January 1565. There was a battle fought about 100 kilometers away, and it was lost. The king and the military commanders were killed, and they rushed back to the capital. They grabbed everything and retreated, and then all the troops arrived, and then we have accounts of the sacking and burning of the city and their various, exaggerated and hysterical accounts of what happened. But these are the results, what you saw. The place was burnt
And
abandoned.
Were they the Sultanate?
The armies of the Sultanate kingdoms of the Deccan, there were 5 sultanates, and they squabbled all the time together, but for this moment, they all joined forces because they felt that Vijayanagara was such a threat. Now, I don't want to use the word Muslims because how many of the people in these armies were Muslim or Hindu, we don't have any idea. So, I mean, the sultans employed Hindus in their armies, the Hindu kings employed Muslims in their armies. So it's not a Muslim-Hindu thing, you should understand.
When was the bazaar in the surrounding area, when was that bulldozed and removed?
A couple of years ago. You mean what I just showed? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, just very recently. Yes.
I was there last year and I seem to remember that the bazaar was still there, and over the river there was more of a touristic development there as well.
There's a sort of backpacker zone, which I think is sort of so far is still there, but it's all under threat and bulldozers have been sent in. So it's pretty shocking.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's someone back there.
I just wanted to ask you about if you've come across any of the human heritage aspect of this site, in terms of any lineages, people who claim to be of any particular lineage, whether it be to the royal families or any specific warriors, or any lineage in terms of traditions.
There is a sort of royal family that is connected with Anagondi, which is the town on the other side of the river, and they claim, in some sort of vague way, a link with these Vijayanagara kings, and in fact the young man who is now head of the family calls himself Krishnadevaraya. But I think the linkage is a little bit vague. They are a family of an aristocratic background, but I think probably the actual real link with these Vijayanagara kings is not really secure. So, and the other royal families in this area date from the Maratha invasions of the 18th century, or late 17th century. So there's no real Vijayanagara royal family today, if that's what you need to ask, that we've come across. There may be a few claimants, but...
George, I just wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit more about those, is it Greenlaw, the photographs?
Yes, I showed you a couple of early photographs. And this is a lovely story because we had no idea about this early photography. And when I came back from my first attempt to do a bit of mapping, we're talking now about 1980, there was a phone call from Robert Skelton at the Victorian Art Museum. He said somebody's walked in with all these wax paper negatives and they said they were Indian. And we looked and they got lots of rocks. They look a little bit like Hampi. Would you like to come and have a look at them? And we had no idea that none of these photographs had ever been published. So we had no idea. And there were not 3 or 4, there were 60 odd. It was the largest group of early photographs of any single site in India. And when we had facsimile, there were no original prints, there were only the original negs. When we had them printed up, we realized they were great masterpieces of early photographic topography. They're magnificent photographs. And our Australian photographer, John Gollings, decided he would do a coverage of how it looked today from the same location. So we went around with his tripod trying to find the exact spots where this Alexander Greenlaw had set up his tripod in the 1850s. And after a few weeks he said this guy had the most fantastic eye. You know, there are a million wonderful shots, but he chose these marvellous... And they are, of course, invaluable. And I have done a book, edited a book, on early photography at Hampi, showcasing the Greenlaw photographs and the other photographers who worked in the 1860s and 1870s. So even though you have the impression this is the end of the world and there's nowhere to stay and nobody ever went there, this is not true. In the 1850s and 1860s there was traffic. People were there, looking, enjoying it.
An exhibition calls, George. And there's a lady up there in pink. What about the relationship between this and literature? Perhaps any of the writing by Krishnadev Raya himself? Because the major poems and things, did they reflect any of the themes that you've said, especially the temple architecture?
There is a Telugu text called the Vijayanagara, which you may know about, which is a sort of a text on statecraft, which is attributed to one of the kings of Krishnadev Raya. And this gives you an insight into the sort of politics and the sort of ways in which kingdoms should be governed. And there, of course, is a tremendous literature that goes with this culture. These kings were famous for sponsoring Telugu and Kannada language poems and a revival in religious texts, and I'm not the right person to talk really much about it. But what you're seeing, what I've shown you tonight, is the physical, if you like, apparatus of a culture which had a vivid literature as well. You're absolutely right to point that out.
Well, I think one last question down here. The microphone is coming.
Thank you for the fantastic talk again. I just have one question. I don't know if it's a memory lapse, but I guess about 6 to 7 years ago when I went there, that hall that you showed in Hampi had a musically column to it.
The famous musical pillars.
Yes.
Now, there must be many of you who've been to Hampi who have been entertained by local, I would say, attendants who tapped away at those colonnettes and told you that it was all a sort of lithic sort of scale. Now, we've had some very serious studies on this. There was a very crazy American professor who arrived with tape recorder. Do you remember tape recorders? This is a long time ago. And he taped all these tones and he put them into some machine and decided that they all should be. So there's been a great effort to coordinate these tones emitted by this granite with scales, with ragas. I don't think it's convincing. I think if you cut granite, or if you don't cut granite, you just have slabs of granite steps. As you step on them, they emit a tone. This type of stone has a sort of acoustic to it, and every variation in the cutting of the stone will produce a different tone. So that's not surprising, and if you go to Madurai or other temples which have all these colonnettes, they all emit tones. So it's a wonderful idea, and we had this, fantasy of people tapping away like this and dancers, musicians. So I think not.
George, can I just say you have seduced us tonight, from Hampa to elephant garrows. You've been brilliant. Thank you so much for telling us about it.